Hi, welcome back to Memos to the President. I'm Ylli with SCSP.ai. This is my second episode outdoors here on the beautiful National Mall Day. And I couldn't find a better guest than Luke Murry, my friend, who is now the head of government affairs with Marvell Technologies, but before served as the national security advisor to Kevin McCarthy. Luke, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's a beautiful day here.
It is a beautiful day.
It's probably the last beautiful day in October.
That's right. We got about a week left.
All right. Well, it's finally good to have you on our show. I mean, you're part of the Fusion Commission. You're helping us with that. But you and I met each other when I was part of the AI Commission and you were working for Speaker McCarthy.
That's right.
So what I wanted to do with this conversation really is hit a couple of themes. Number one is, how did you get to Washington? Then your time on the Hill. Then the U.S. China tech competition, because you worked hard on that, and then ask you about the current job that you have with Marvell. So let's start first with, how did you get to Washington? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I feel like everybody has a different story in how they get to Washington, and yet there are some themes that kind of run through these different stories. For me, I was born and raised in LA, particularly near the port, so it's a very blue-collar town, lots of longshoremen. My family wasn't very political. I knew one parent was a Republican, and the other parent was a Democrat, but I couldn't tell you which was which. And yet, I was also raised Christian. So there were these theological underpinnings, which my parents were emphasizing, which then would end up shaping my political views. And I understand, for some that means they go and they're a Democrat. For others, they go and they're Republican. But kind of sanctity of life and the respect and dignity that every human life deserves, or this idea that the government should reward those who do good and should punish those who do evil. And that's not just in law enforcement or national security, that's also in the economic sphere as well.
Right.
We shouldn't allow the rich to fleece the poor, or if you work hard, you should be rewarded with it. We should have a system that rewards hard work, where you at least have the opportunity then to succeed. And so it's kind of from those underpinnings that just naturally, I don't even know why, right? Like one parent versus the other gravitated towards Republicans. I can remember, Bush v. Clinton, and then, Dole versus Clinton in both those elections. I was in elementary school and junior high, and growing up in LA, like definite minority in supporting Republicans, but I did. Right. And, it's probably 90-10 Dems versus Republicans there. And then from there, and kind of how do you fast forward and get to DC, I think I was just naturally interested in political science issues. Government and political science is a really interesting issue in the sense of math. And, some people love this, right? Like there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer.
Right.
In government and political science, how do you best go about creating a flourishing society? Like, did John Stuart Mill get it right on just war theory? Maybe, maybe not, but you're free to disagree. Did Rousseau get it right on the state of man? And you can disagree on that. And that actually, where you stand or land on those debates or those arguments or those views really does inform policy and what kind of government you think should be created. So I just naturally gravitated towards that. I took political science classes in college, and out of all the classes I took, I was like, oh, that's my home. I love that stuff. I'm just naturally interested in that.
Where did you go to college?
I did undergrad at UCLA, graduate school at Georgetown. And even that graduate school choice, to me, what was most important was national security. Right. Because that has just dramatic consequences. Yeah. When you're talking about life and death, when you're talking about whether to go to war or not, send your brother, your uncle, your son to war. And that's just, to me, that carried a significance in ways in which other areas of foreign policy just didn't. And so national security for me was, I thought.
Did you study security studies at Georgetown?
Yep, that's right. Yeah. Master's in security studies.
It's a good program, yeah.
But then kind of intermixed in that, in terms of getting to DC, actually the summer after my freshman year in college, I did an internship at a local think tank here, kind of randomly helping out on Romanian politics in the fall of Ceausescu, and doing some political analysis on that. But I wasn't really doing that many hours a week. Yeah. And I was crashing with my aunt and uncle at the time over in Arlington. And my aunt was basically like, you need to find more to do. It's only 20 hours of work. Yeah. What else can you do? And so I ended up getting a job with a freshman congressman who was actually from Florida, named Andrew Crenshaw. And not a job, an internship. And that was 2 months. And that was actually over the course of 9/11. That was 2001. So that too, I think, just kind of reaffirmed my desire to work in national security, being here in this town over 9/11, the kind of experience that was. And then you have to fast forward 6 years. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's finishing undergraduate, going to work for a year, going to graduate school. eventually finding my way back to Crenshaw's office, who had a job for a mail guy, a legislative correspondent was my first job on the Hill, but the internship kind of helped me get my foot in the door in that sense.
I mean, we were talking earlier about how do people land these jobs because it's such a puzzle in Washington. Once you were there, what was your journey up to the Speaker McCarthy's office?
Yeah, I think some of the hardest part really is getting your foot in the door.
Right.
And did I want to be a legislative correspondent right out of graduate school? No, quite frankly,
does,
but it was a great crash course in what is the role of constituents and their kind of direct input into a congressman's office, and how does that factor into a congressman's decision. So then when I became a legislative assistant in that office, I then knew how much weight to give on what issue for constituent opinions that came in. It helped me inform. It also helped me communicate, right? Because you're drafting letters to constituents on every issue, working with your LAs, but on every issue. So you understand that kind of style and you start to work on that. And then from legislative assistant, Andrew Crenshaw was a wonderful member. He was very senior on approps, state foreign ops, defense subcommittees, right where you want to be.
All important committees,
Right, where you want to work. But he had great staff, senior staff, who was working those issues. And so there really was an opportunity for me to get involved in those issues too much, as much as they did try and knowing my natural interest and my degrees. And then so I kind of transitioned horizontally to be a legislative assistant in another office. And that was Congressman Ted Poe from Texas, from the Houston area, and did his foreign policy work for about 4 years as legislative assistant. And at that time, I had kind of been a legislative assistant for a total of 6 years. And I had people kind of telling me, what are you doing? That's a long time to be a legislative assistant. Are you sure
you're enjoying life here in LA?
You should think about what's next.
Right.
And I do think that sometimes there can be this pressure to go on and move on to something that's next. And yet, for whatever reason, I just felt like, I'm still learning. I'm still getting a lot out of this job. I was staffing him on the Foreign Affairs Committee and writing questions and statements for him as his legislative assistant. And then kind of, I didn't foresee this when I joined his office, but he ended up being senior enough on Foreign Affairs Committee where he ends up being the chairman of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee. So I go over and be his staff director there. And it turned out that legislative assistant job was really helpful for me in that staff director job, because by that time I had been to dozens of hearings. I knew what made a good hearing and what made a bad hearing.
Yeah.
I knew what made an effective witness and ineffective witness, how to push a bill or a political agenda via a hearing. And then on the TNT subcommittee, I did that for about 4 years before transitioning to the leader's office.
Yeah. And in the leader's office, you also rose to the ranks. I mean, it's not that you overnight became the national security advisor to the leader, right? So what was the initial portfolio there? And then how that led to the national security advisor position?
Yeah, actually with Leader McCarthy, I did kind of drop in as national security advisor, but I don't think I really understood everything that entailed that job. And there definitely was a learning curve in terms of understanding what the job is and what the job isn't. I kind of got from working with leadership in previous jobs that setting the agenda, particularly for the party, for Republicans, or at least helping set the agenda, obviously a very team effort, was a core part of the job. But there are other things, nuances that I didn't really understand. So as National Security Advisor to the leader, one of your principal duties is to manage committees.
Right.
You don't want committees passing a bill that's going to cause trouble on the House floor, or that just isn't good policy.
Right.
So, or that's going to split your party or something like that. Right. So there's that kind of, and that's all the national security committees: Foreign Affairs, Intel, Armed Services, Homeland. Then the other element is working with your colleagues and the leader in terms of jurisdictional disagreements. So who gets to call balls and strikes when ENC disagrees with Armed Services or vice versa? Right. And somebody has to basically play referee between committees in that area. Then just like a personal assistant, legislative assistant in a personal office, you do want to push priorities in terms of legislation that the leader has. And the leader definitely had those national security priorities. Particularly, it was the nexus between tech and national security. So that was really interesting for me in pushing those priorities. You're also the leader's designee, particularly if you're the minority leader or the speaker on HIPC. And that's a big responsibility. You're attending those hearings, you're attending briefings, you're staffing him on Gang of Eight. And really the responsibility there is, as you learn about intelligence matters, what kind of effective oversight needs to be done. because at the end of the day, only so many people are going to know about these issues. And if you're not doing the oversight, or the committee's not doing the oversight that they need to be doing, that's a real risk to the American people and America's national security. So kind of influencing it through the intelligence process is core. And then, setting the agenda. Like, what should our priorities be as a party, at least in the House, for pushing the national security agenda? And then the last thing is working with the administration. So serving as a principal House liaison, particularly to the White House, to the National Security Council, and working with them to push our policy agenda.
Right. The one thing I was thinking about is that the first 2 years, obviously, Republicans were in the House majority.
Yeah.
And then, after 2018 elections,
Yeah.
they become a minority. So how does that shift in your portfolio and your job?
Yeah.
I mean, what was the advantages and disadvantages of before and after?
Yeah, that's that whole transition between majority and minority. So when I started working for Leader McCarthy, he was the majority leader. He was number 2 to Speaker Ryan. And in that job, the speaker really has, as is true of every speaker, absolute control over the House, insofar as he's empowered by, or she's empowered by and then the members, right? Like, you're only as good of a speaker as your members let you be, or as powerful as a speaker as your members let you be. They are kind of your constituents in that sense. But for majority leader, that function was really, you're managing legislation, you're managing the bills that are coming to the floor. And so it does have this kind of substantive policy element to it, but you're not quite diving as deep as you are on the committee level, where you're actually writing bills and legislation and amendments and those kinds of things. You can push those things, but you're not nearly as involved in the legislative process. Minority leader is different. On the one hand, you're not deciding what bills come to the floor. You're not pushing that agenda. You have to be more reactionary in that sense. And yet also, you do want to find opportunities to work on a bipartisan basis, particularly when it comes to national security issues, where you can work with the majority to push these important priority areas. And so we did have, I think, good cooperation with Pelosi's office at the time, with Majority Leader Hoyer's office at the time, to push some important pieces of legislation. And then there was this, you go from being the number 2 Republican in the majority to being the number 1 Republican in the minority as minority leader. And that takes on just the added significance in terms of intelligence matters. Whereas in the majority leader job, I didn't have that kind of access on HIPSI or to Gang of 8. In the minority leader job, I did, and that was a much bigger part of my portfolio.
Interesting.
In that role.
Was there any specific story you remember fondly from this that you managed to pass through on the national security side?
Yeah. So if you think about, really, 2017, 2018, you started to see Congress really pay attention on all things China related. And so, one example is CFIUS reform, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. We passed a bill called FIRMA and worked a lot with the administration in basically enhancing CFIUS powers to regulate investment that's done in critical sectors of the economy. You want to make sure that you continue to control, you as in the United States, control assets that are sensitive to U.S. national security, even domestically here in the U.S. There were other issues which the administration kind of took the lead on, but then Congress followed up on. So think about Huawei and ZTE bans or prohibitions or partial bans. And then Congress would follow up with codifying or even moving further in National Defense Authorization Acts that were pushed. So it's things like that where there were real opportunities. And then I think the last one was, I mentioned kind of personal priorities of the leader. I was not the first to this party, and this is true and still needs to be true in terms of what we need to work on for the United States national security, but integrating innovation into DoD was a real personal passion of the leaders and just a critical issue to U.S. national security. So in 2017, I started talking to a lot of tech companies who actually went through the pilot project phase at DoD, but then had this gap of like 2 years before they could get on a program of record. It's just this arcane system of how our budgeting process works. And I really kind of struggled. How do you bridge that gap? But it was talking through folks who had worked at DoD Comptroller's office, folks who worked on appropriations, working with current appropriations staff and members, particularly Representative Ken Calvert's office. And we basically developed this fund called the Warfighter Innovation Fund. And the idea was you pick a few winners, select winners, but you give them really meaningful dollars, like $10 to $50 million to bridge that gap, that 2-year gap, that quote unquote valley of death. That was eventually appropriated $100 million in FY 2022 as a pilot project. This year, it's on track to go up to $400 million and actually be a program of record.
Yeah.
So that's something which the leader put a lot of blood and sweat behind,
Right.
and I'm proud to see continue.
We talked about, see, we have a lot of tourists here visiting DC now.
That's great.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it's a beautiful day. You talked about shift towards focusing more on China.
Yeah.
And you were there in the middle of all this, I think generational shift in terms of how we view China, in terms of national security, innovation, technology. How did that come about? What were some of the big moving pieces? You obviously were talking to the White House at that time, but how did that happen on the Hill?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? So my career was 2007 to 2021,
right.
And I think one of the inflection points was 2011. Yeah. So Obama campaigns on, the bad war is essentially the war in Iraq, the good war is the war in Afghanistan. And in 2011, I think in part because he was working on getting out of Iraq, they announced this pivot towards Asia.
Right.
But also we do need to be focusing on Asia. At that time, Congress really isn't ready to hear that.
Yeah.
And he gets a lot of pushback on both sides about what does this pivot mean, particularly in resources, in a time where, it is finite resources.
Middle of two wars,
Yeah, middle of two wars, and you only have so many defense dollars that you're spending. What does this really make? And then also, what does pivot to Asia mean in terms of a policy announcement when it gets down to funding and budget, right? If you want to really know my priority, look at my budget, don't look at my policy announcements kind of thing. But then 2015 is another market shift. So in September 2015, Xi Jinping, President Obama have this joint press conference in the Rose Garden. Xi Jinping basically pledges not to militarize Spratly Islands.
Right.
What happens the next year? Fall of 2015 into 2016, that's exactly what he does, right? So anti-aircraft systems, runways, jet hangars, ammunition depots, all put in on these islands, and that military buildup continues. I think that really was a turning point for the Obama administration. I think that was therefore, and kind of relatedly, a turning point for Democrats on the Hill, and especially for Republicans. That kind of morphed into, okay, China is a much bigger threat than we thought.
Right.
Corresponding,
this is not the China we hoped for.
Right, and at that same time, as you well know, China itself shifts in other ways. Wolf warrior diplomacy, where they're much more aggressive abroad and kind of standing up for what they believe is right and thinking they need to punch in a more kind of in-your-face way. That really starts around 2015 and lasts through COVID.
Right.
And that, I don't know if that was very effective. It certainly wasn't effective with Congress. And I think really rubbed members the wrong way in that kind of rhetoric that was coming out of Beijing. And then another element was thinking about their Made in China initiative, which they start in 2015. They have this goal of dominating technologies in 2025, or at least becoming more self-sufficient.
Global AI leader by 2030.
And that's explicit, right?
Yeah.
That's in writing.
Exactly.
They're saying the
People
quiet
have
part
doubts.
out loud. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's starting to build up. And we actually had an interesting exercise in 2017, 2018, where we started to see these cross-jurisdictional issues, these challenges, whether it's energy or military integration of technology, human rights, commerce and finance. China was actually playing a role in each of these areas. And so you have all of these committees who are actually starting to hold hearings on China and organize policy decisions on China. How do we integrate that into a way which makes strategic, coherent sense in what our policy, at least from a House perspective, should be as regards to China? And we didn't want that to be a partisan exercise. Right? This is a national security issue which Democrats, Republicans, your average American needs to care about, should care about, and needs to do something about. So this task force was proposed to deal with China, and the idea was we would get a bunch of committee members from different committees that were doing work on China. You bring in committee staff, you bring in some personal office staff as well, and you basically bring them together. What are the most important issues, and can we all agree on what are some policy prescriptions? Unfortunately, Democrats backed out of that bipartisan task force, so Republicans went ahead anyways and did it. And it was actually that task force, it produced over a 50-page report, over 400 recommendations, and it really morphed into becoming an exercise of what happens, what should be our policy, should we take power again, back from the Democrats in the House, what is going to be our game plan? And that ended up being what was turned into the China Select Committee
Right.
was kind of the outgrowth of that China task force.
Which still exists. You are now in private sector, working for Marvell Technologies. How do you view now the competition from the private sector side? What has strike to the most now being on the other side of government?
Yeah, it's been another learning curve for me, just like Congress was. But it's been really insightful in terms of seeing from a private sector standpoint, U.S. China competition. It's definitely a different lens to look through. And there's been a couple things that have really stood out to me during this period. Particularly if you think about U.S. China competition in the last 10 or 15 years. One is, no question, there is this trend towards reducing interdependence.
Yeah.
Now that was galvanized through COVID, but it had already started pre-COVID.
With Huawei's deploying 5G.
Yes,
all those
exactly,
things.
Exactly. 5G kind of being the preeminent example of that and reducing interdependence, with U.S. not really having a viable option, and quite frankly, still not really a viable option. But then, with COVID stretching into pharmaceuticals, semiconductor chips, those kinds of things, I think that trend is, and to be clear, that trend really, China started that and made in China 2025, 2015, they announced they want to reduce interdependence. That was a strategic goal, which China was saying, and the U.S. kind of has come along and said, yeah, we also have these interdependencies, which are not good for us. So that's one, it's just seeing that interdependence, and sometimes that is helpful for the private sector, and sometimes private sector has to adapt to that and adjust and understand that, okay, market access or things like that is going to look different in this era.
Shifting,
Right. And then the second thing is seeing technology as a national security asset. I work for a tech company. And to be clear, this is not unique to this era, but I do think in this era, what fits into that technology bucket that's critical to national security, that is a bigger bucket than maybe it's ever been. And I get that, right? Because you have technologies like chips, like AI, which really proliferate our society. And if they are so impactful throughout all these different sectors of society, maybe they do need to be relegated. And I sort of think the challenge there is, how do you put in proper controls so you're not helping your adversary beat you, and yet at the same time, you're not stifling innovation to the point where the private sector can't compete globally because their controls are so tight that they can't keep innovating, they can't keep funneling money into R&D and making sure that we stay ahead of the competition.
How would you assess our current state of policies in this space? Because what you said is, it's really hard. It's really hard. There's been a lot of debate about export controls, the effectiveness of export controls. When is the moment that you stifle innovation, as you said? So how do you strike that right balance? What is our current posture for that?
That's a really hard question, because I think you have to kind of have a nuanced position on these export controls. I think it's really important, maybe just a couple of things, right? We were wrestling with this issue back on FIRMA and CFIUS. How far should we go, and how much control should CFIUS have? And in that sense, it was more of how do we keep particularly the financial sector flourishing in the United States, which is a big strength for the United States, without relegating it so much in terms of the investments. You're seeing that same debate still play out on outbound investment into China, and what is relegating U.S., how Americans can spend their money and invest their money. So that tension is still very much there. And obviously export controls, constantly being updated, constantly being tweaked, what's effective and what's not. I think there's certain areas where we were just late to the game, and it took us too long to put in the kind of controls that were necessary, and we allowed massive buildup. And yet in other ways, I feel like we don't properly understand the technologies that we're relegating, and we end up relegating technology which doesn't have the kind of effect that it does. So I think the role of private sector is really important here, because private sector, nobody better understands technology than the people who develop that technology and are marketing that technology, and have actually turned that technology into a marketable product that can be used. So to be able to have a very close dialogue with the administration and with Congress is really critical for the private sector, in making sure that these kind of controls in place. Look, it's up to the administration, it's up to Congress, what kind of controls they decide are best, but making sure that they have all the information that they need to make those kind of decisions, which doesn't unintentionally have second, third order effects which actually undermines the primary purpose of the legislation or of the regulation that they're putting in place.
No, you're right. My last set of questions really are related to how you navigate DC career. I mean, you and I talked about this. What makes you succeed? How do you get to become the national security advisor to the Speaker of the House? A lot of people come here, they study, they want to serve. And so what would be your advice to young people that want to serve, that want to come to DC? How can you navigate this puzzle?
Yeah. Again, everybody kind of has their own different story of how to do this. But I think there is kind of two themes that kind of run in my work, and I hope are applicable to others, or at least helpful to others. One is just do a really good job, no matter what job you're doing. You know, I was legislative correspondent, my first job on the Hill. I want to be the best legislative correspondent that I possibly could be. And, you know, there were actually skills there which I could demonstrate to give my boss confidence that I could do the next job, right? Like, am I a good writer? Am I a good listener? Do I properly understand the issue? And can I disseminate that issue into, you know, a few paragraphs that your average constituent is going to be able to understand? Back on the Trade, Non-Proliferation, Terrorism Subcommittee, my first hire on that subcommittee was a guy named Jeff Dressler. He jumps from that subcommittee to become Leader McCarthy's National Security Advisor, and then Speaker Ryan's National Security Advisor. And then, you know, when he leaves Leader McCarthy's office to go to Speaker Ryan's office, who does he recommend? He recommends me. And if I was the kind of boss, you know, that wasn't kind to him, or didn't treat him with respect, or didn't really value him, I mean, it's easy to value Jeff. He's phenomenal. You know, then maybe he doesn't recommend me. So there's that kind of dual thing of, one, do a great job no matter where you are or what you're doing. You never know who's watching, and then, you know, you're going to be ready to promote or ready for another job because they see you and they pick you from there and they put you in this other position. And then just be kind, right? Like, if I wasn't kind to Jeff, you know, who knows whether he recommends me or not. And everybody has some sort of example where, you know, maybe it's your former intern all of a sudden is your new boss. You never know how that's going to turn around. And even if being kind to other people doesn't clearly advance your career, it's just the right thing to do, and you should do it anyways. It will make the world a better
Don't
place.
Don't fake it. Like, be nice.
Be genuine, be nice. It's only going to help you.
Luke, thank you so much for your service.
Thanks,
I think the only thing missing today here were the ice cream trucks, which you can always see in the National Mall. But truly appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and thanks for coming out here on such a gorgeous day, and look forward to continuing our conversation.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, Ylli.
Thank you.